Hi, thanks everybody for being here tonight. This is wonderful, and Brad for hosting this wonderful webinar. We're just honoured to have you with us and all your guests over the next few weeks. I'm going to get Brad to give you an overview of the course, but I just wanted to really introduce Brad and his organisation MAPS, which is www.maps.org. Which you all probably know. Brad is the Director of Communications and Marketing at MAPS, and he's had a very specific interest and focus on the political, scientific and cultural changes required to make illicit drugs into legitimate medicines. And that's really what the discussion is going to follow, and how that's advancing. And MAPS is definitely a pioneer and at the frontier of this current discussion. So we're really excited to hear all these things that you're going to impart. He's also interned for the Drug Policy Alliance, has a very strong and committed interest in drug policy reform and activism. So Brad, we're looking forward to hearing about that too. He also believes in the importance of communication, community building around the subject, and really that's what this webinar platform is about. So it's giving us all a chance to participate in this dialogue. And I'm just going to hand it over to you, Brad. And as Jeremy said, please feel free to send both he and I questions as the webinar is happening, because I've already got a few in the chat box. So we'll be eager to hear everybody's questions at the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Henrietta and Jeremy, and everybody at Evolver Learning Lab for inviting MAPS on board to do this course. This is our second webinar series with Evolver Learning Lab, our last one on general psychedelic science and how to apply those lessons to your life. Went so great, we decided to come back and do another one, and this has been so far even more successful. We have so many participants, 130 and growing online right now, which is pretty impressive, especially considering we're scheduled at a particular time and there's no guarantee that everybody can make it. So first off, thank you, all of you participants who are joining us now for making time and being part of this conversation. A portion of the proceeds from this, they're all split between Evolver and MAPS, so a portion of them go to directly support psychedelic and medical marijuana research and education. Little quick background about MAPS. MAPS is a 501c3 nonprofit research and educational organization. We were founded all the way back in 1986 when I was 3 years old, so don't take any credit for that part. But for the last 30 years, MAPS has been working progressively, led by my boss and MAPS founder, Rick Doblin, who will be joining us for the very last session, to restore psychedelics. To restore psychedelics and marijuana back to a place in science and medicine where they can be really looked at from a rational standpoint. So much of what MAPS is doing and so much of what is happening in the psychedelic science sphere right now is clinically oriented. It's about research and science and collecting the data. And that's been our main focus. That's been MAPS's main focus, because with the political doors blocked, with the criminalization of MDMA and LSD and marijuana, with the lack of government funding that there's been for this work for many, many decades since the start of the war on drugs, we have to find a new way through, a different way to open the conversation, to get into the headlines, to reduce the stigma that's associated with psychedelics and cannabis. And to do that, we've focused on the medical route. So collecting data, getting scientific studies published, and working with the Food and Drug Administration to get psychedelics, first MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, approved for specific medical conditions, with the hopes that will open up the conversation and ultimately bring a new stream of funding in that could support future psychedelic and medical marijuana research, so that we no longer have to ask for donations. So that's been our main focus, is moving the scientific route forward. But part of why I'm so excited about this course is because it's a chance to talk about what I see as, in many senses, the broader point of what we're doing. Our final goal is not simply to be able to provide people with legal, prescription, insurance-covered psychedelic treatments, but also to encourage the beneficial uses of psychedelics for spirituality and creativity and personal growth. We really want to create contexts where those experiences are legal, and where they're safe, and where people have the adequate education, preparation, guidance, integration needed to really make the most out of their psychedelic experiences. So this course is a great opportunity for MAPS and for our whole community in that way. We get to open up the conversation and talk about not just what the research is saying, but what personal experience is saying, what spiritual practitioners are saying, what ways we can find right now to integrate what we're learning about what psychedelics are and what they can do and in what context they work and in what context they don't, how to integrate that back into our lives. Of course, psychedelics are still illegal in most countries, including in the US. So the only way to legally experience psychedelics at this point is still to participate in clinical research. But we can learn a lot. We can apply a lot of these things to our lives regardless. And of course, people do continue to use psychedelics. They do continue to use Schedule I drugs regardless of the criminal penalties that exist for them, which really exemplifies how the war on drugs has failed over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So this course, again, is part of our opportunity to educate ourselves, educate each other, learn from each other about how we can apply some of these lessons from psychedelics to our lives. All right, so we have over 140 participants now. It just keeps going up. This is really great. I'm really happy to be here today with Allan Badiner and Kokyo Henkel. I'll say a little bit about them. I'll give them a brief introduction in a moment. But first I want to give an overview of the course, just a brief overview of what we're going to be doing with the course. This today is our first session. We'll be speaking about psychedelics and Buddhism. We'll be kind of talking about the possible interactions between psychedelics and Buddhism, how the Buddhist community looks at psychedelic experiences, how people are using Buddhist practices and psychedelics together for their own spiritual growth. So that'll be today. We're going to go into 6:30 Pacific, 9:30 Eastern Time. Next week, on November 11th, we'll have a very special Veterans Day session where I'll be speaking with two U.S. Marine veterans, Ryan LeCompte and Nicholas Blackston, about how spirituality can play into using psychedelic therapy to heal from PTSD. Ryan is beginning to work on a study of ayahuasca treatment for veterans with PTSD, and Nicholas Blackston was featured in the book Acid Test by Tom Schroeder and was a participant in our study of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in veterans. On December 2nd, we're going to skip a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about discovering plant medicines. I'm going to be joined by two amazing women who I've met through the Women's Visionary Congress, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization encouraging conversations with visionary women about plant medicines and psychedelic experiences. Both of these women, Sita Ramaya Sita and Jane Straight, are plant medicine experts. They've been working in the field of psychedelic and visionary plants for many, many years. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with them about how plants in particular and some of their visionary qualities can be used to enhance spiritual experiences. The week following, on December 9th, we're going to be talking about end-of-life experiences. Something that we all think about, all of us being mortal creatures. We don't all get PTSD, but anxiety and feelings about the end of our life, that's something that we can definitely all identify with. So on December 9th, I'll be speaking with Julaine Andreas, who's a marriage and family therapist who is working on a current MAP-sponsored study of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat anxiety in people with life-threatening illness. Also on that day, I'll be joined by Donna Dreyer, who's a Canadian therapist who's been working also on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research. On December 16th, for our last session, really excited for that, we're going to be talking about addiction and using psychedelics to treat addiction and the role of spirituality in healing from addiction. It's not just something pharmacological that's going on. In other words, when people use ibogaine or ayahuasca to address their addictions, but rather something deeper and more spiritual that's happening there too. So we'll be talking with Kevin Franciotti, who's a science writer and also a participant in a MAPS-sponsored ibogaine study, who recovered from his own opiate addiction following his participation in that study. And also with Rick Doblin, my boss, who founded MAPS in 1986. He'll be talking about some of his own ibogaine experiences and also some of MAPS's more general work. So that's the trajectory of our course. Really excited to get going with Allan and Kokyo now. Allan, you've been a supporter of MAPS and our work for a very long time. You've participated in what we've done in so many ways. Your new edition of Zigzag Zen, which I really hope you'll talk about a little bit, has really helped open up the conversation about how psychedelics and Buddhism can interplay with each other. Also, Allan, you've done work with the Zendo Project, our harm reduction program, which MAPS provides at events. It'd be great if you wanted to say a little bit about your experience there too. Kokyo, I became familiar with your work, Kokyo, when you spoke a couple of years ago with James Fadiman in Santa Cruz. Had a conversation with Jim Fadiman, who's a psychedelic researcher and psychologist, who's been working in the field of psychedelic research for many years. That conversation that you had with him about psychedelics and Buddhism to a packed room in Santa Cruz just really motivated me and got me thinking more about my own meditation practice and got thinking about how psychedelics and Buddhism can really intersect and relate. So just growing on that conversation. Kokyo is also the head teacher at the Santa Cruz Zen Center, so a leader in his own Buddhist community, and coming out here and speaking with us. We're really honored to have your presence here, and just for being willing to explore some of these really interesting areas at the intersections of this ancient practice and psychedelics, these new and interesting tools. So, Allan, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Big Sur, where I live.
Wow.
And I'll mention that something like 25 years ago, when I was building my house here, Rick Doblin was in my driveway. He was still in school, and he was attending a workshop at Esalen. And he was going on and on about how he was going to make MDMA a legal medicine, and et cetera. And I just looked at him and I thought, Rick, you're hallucinating. You know, get a job, do something. I mean, this is not going to happen. And it's really a testament to his vision and to his obstinance and to his ability to stay the course. And despite, I think, virtually everybody thinking it was impossible. And I'm so happy to see the success that MAPS has had. And Brad, you've been a big part of it too. And it's just really exciting to me, and I want to thank MAPS and Evolver, first of all, for this event and for my participation in it.
Great, thanks, Allan. I figured, Allan, since you're already talking, do you want to start us off and just sort of say a little bit about Zigzag Zen and your experience with Buddhism, experience with psychedelics, maybe what motivated you to write Zigzag Zen and what you're doing now? Or rather, to edit Zigzag Zen.
Sure. So Zigzag Zen, and the rest of the title of the book is Buddhism and Psychedelics, came about as a result of my own curiosity. I would have to say that unlike most people, my real experience of psychedelics came secondly. In most cases, people have a psychedelic experience and they pursue Buddhism as a way to a more sustainable way to pursue that same state. For me, it was the other way around. Buddhism was the gateway drug, and I had an experience that I wanted to see if I could bring back, and it was very hard. I had a hard time doing that, and I became more open to the possibility of taking psychedelics, which for me was a big step. I'm very conservative, ironically, on the subject of psychedelics, at least in terms of my personal use. And I was pretty straight edge until I was 30. I was 35 before I smoked a joint, and I was 62 before I took LSD. Although in the intervening years, there was quite a bit of experience with psilocybin. But so I pursued it because I was fascinated that the people who introduced Buddhism to America, to the West, were also the same people who were talking about psychedelics. Whether it be Allen Ginsberg or Alan Watts or Ram Dass or Jack Kerouac. I mean, there's quite a long list. And in addition to that, I also became aware, out of just questioning those teachers that I knew, that almost every Buddhist teacher that was Western born had an experience with psychedelics prior to their becoming a Buddhist teacher. So I thought that was very, very significant as well. And I thought that there's a story that needed to be told. And up until that time, there was no books that dealt with both subjects, because inherently I think they're very different, but they have similar goals and similar results. So I thought that a book about that would be very interesting. And also, not just a book about it, but a way for different perspectives to show up in the same book. I thought that would be really valuable. So it's not, I invited a variety of people with different opinions, actually, to write their experiences. And so it makes for a real interesting way for you to identify those ideas that you agree with and come to your own conclusions, as opposed to just adopting somebody else's point of view. So for all those reasons, I was happy to jump into the project, and it was a labor of love. And there was a first edition about 15 years ago, and then there seemed to be enough interest, and original copies were selling for like $150 on Amazon. So I thought, oh, it's time to get this back in print. And I was very happy that Synergetic Press was delighted to do a new edition. There are 6 new chapters, including the chapter with Kokyo and James Fadiman. The text of that very exciting conversation that you were there for, Brad, is also in the book. And and some interesting other pieces too, which I can go into later, but as well as a lot of new art. Alex Gray was my partner on the book, and he brought incredible visionary art from a variety of amazing artists from all over the world, as well as his own, into the book. So so I'm very happy that is out, and it's doing very well. And what else can I say?
Well, there's a lot of different Buddhisms out there. So maybe since one of the topics of our conversation is Buddhism, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your practice and the community that you've been part of.
Sure. Well, you're right. There is a lot of different Buddhisms, and probably the main difference between different kinds of Buddhism is whether it's approached as strictly as a religion or as a philosophical, a body of teachings and a wisdom tradition. And they're both as well in many cases. So that's a big distinction. The Buddhism that I became involved with was under the direction of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I had the good fortune of meeting him on his second trip to the U.S. about 30 years ago, and became his student. And after I was married, I spent a lot of time each summer in retreat with him and my family. And in fact, it was one time in Plum Village, which is his meditation retreat center in France, that we had after a Dharma talk, we had a discussion, a Dharma discussion group, it's called. And we divided into 20 people each, and each Dharma discussion group had a topic. And the topic of our group was drugs, which was very interesting because I was expecting people to say, "Oh, I tried drugs and they're just not for me," and but actually it was quite different. People started talking about their experience with drugs, and it was as if a seal had come off, and the cap had been removed, and they were able to finally talk about it. And I watched these people light up as they talked about their experiences, and I thought, again, this is very interesting, and it's a story that needs to be told. So that was actually the prime motivator for taking on the book Zigzag Zen. So Thich Nhat Hanh, his branch of Zen comes from Japan, ultimately from China, and that was the. I think a lot of people are familiar with Zigzag Zen. I mean, with Thich Nhat Hanh's form of Zen, and so it was interesting too that Thich Nhat Hanh, being an Asian teacher, unlike the American teachers of Buddhism, was they're typically don't want to hear about psychedelics. They don't understand it. They don't have any experience culturally with it, and they look at it as an opportunity to become intoxicated or deluded. And so I was concerned about what Thich Nhat Hanh would say or think about my doing a book about psychedelics and Buddhism, and but he put my mind at ease when he said to me, when he congratulated me for doing the book, and I thought, oh, I don't think he read it, but I think he was he was happy that at least I was giving equal opportunity for those who did not think that Buddhism and psychedelics mix at all to have their say. So so that seemed to go off okay.
Yeah, it's definitely a productive tension. As soon as we posted up about the course on our Facebook wall, a conversation immediately erupted. Immediately, this was Buddhism supports psychedelics, and then no, it doesn't, and it just it just went on. I was like, great, this is going to be an excellent conversation then. Great.
Well, I mean, actually, yeah. Well, I was going to say that I think that although Buddhism and psychedelics are very distinct and very different, actually, my perspective is that Buddhism is psychedelic. I mean, if you look at the meaning of psychedelic, mind manifesting, mind opening, I mean, if Buddhism isn't doing that, it's not Buddhism. So I think they share a great deal, in terms of the importance that they both place on coming to terms with your morality, with impermanence, to comprehend things directly as opposed to theoretically or abstractly, to understand the tenuous border between self and others, so that that's where compassion and empathy comes in. So there's a great deal that they have in common in that sense, different as they are from each other.
Oh, that's great, Allan. We're going to hinge on that one. That's really good. Kokyo, thank you again for joining us from Santa Cruz. Are you at the Zen Center now?
Yes.
Great. So how did you first come into Buddhism, and how did you first figure out what psychedelics were?
Well, it was in my early 20s. I met both of them around the same time in those college years, and felt that they had a lot in common. I felt that the Buddhist tradition was giving a kind of language and putting into words the experiences I was having with psychedelics, and gave a way also to work with and cultivate those experiences in a stable kind of way. So both around the same time, and then within 5 years or so, I was ended up living in monasteries and monasteries and monastic kind of communities for almost the next 20 years. So in most of these communities, they have a lot of rules about any drugs and alcohol. So it was okay with me to put that all aside and just really focus on Buddhist practice. Although I always honored it as a real catalyst for getting into meditation practice, and almost like a teacher, like a early teacher for me, spiritual teacher. And but it was just not the context for exploring those experiences. Although, just as Allan said, in these monastic communities, when there'd be chances for people to describe their path of practice, which we would often have meetings where people would give short stories how they came to practice. Many, maybe I could even say the majority of people had psychedelics in their background as a catalyst for getting into Zen practice. And these were the people that were living full time in the monastery. So definitely a connection, and yet at the same time, it's a real taboo topic, as you mentioned. You know, people have strong opinions on both sides, and I think partly it's around these precepts, the Buddhist precepts, and there's the precepts of ethical conduct. I'm a Buddha, and there's this fifth precept that's the original languages that the Buddha offered as a kind of training rule for both monks and lay people, is not drinking alcohol that leads to heedlessness or carelessness, which he meant as basically violating other forms of ethical conduct out of confusion and carelessness. So and then in the other Buddhist countries since that time, they always, when you look back at the original Asian languages, they always translate it as alcohol as opposed to intoxicants in general. So I think it may be America and the modern West where that precept gets interpreted as not taking intoxicants, and I think for good reasons it gets interpreted this way. But then people, just as in the drug war, all substances get lumped into the same category of intoxicants without really questioning, well, what are the effects?
Right.
So, I think that's partly why it's a taboo topic. That people say, well, the Buddha said no intoxicants of any kind, but he actually didn't really say that, and the tradition hasn't said that. But it is a point to be really careful about. What's our motivation for substance or any kind of activity at all, in fact.
Yeah, so you're kind of, or you kind of see it more as that fifth precept as discouraging any sorts of activities that would lead you to stray from the other precepts or to violate any of the other principles, or to be careless, which is the opposite, of course, of mindfulness.
And particularly, carelessness means like harming others in a way that's just disrespecting and not taking into account others' well-being. And there are definitely drugs and alcohol that can create that kind of carelessness. And it just seems to me, and psychedelics, I wouldn't rule it out that would never happen for someone, but in general, for myself and for others, it often seems to be quite the opposite. It leads to more care and respect for others and for all of life and for the earth itself. So it's true. I don't think we could say that across the board, but depending on set and setting and intention, it can have that kind of opposite effect. Also, I heard it said that an interesting way to look at this point is basically that everything we do all day long is to alter consciousness in one way or another. I mean, having food, watching a movie, coming to this webinar, reading a book, meditating, all Buddhist practices are to create a kind of some different kind of state of mind, either better or worse, I suppose. You could say almost everything we do, unless we're just never move or do anything, we're always actually, as human beings, and maybe as all sentient beings, we're doing activity to alter consciousness. And so I think that's an interesting perspective on this question of, some people would say, well, any drugs or substances are altering consciousness, and so as a Buddhist practice, we wouldn't want to do that. But in fact, we have to really look at what that means. Everything is altering consciousness, and how do can we choose how we alter it in a positive way?
Yeah. I remember you mentioned, Kokyo, that a lot of the people who you encountered in your retreats had mentioned that psychedelics were at least part of their past, that they had experienced them before. Were these primarily Westerners, or did they come from all parts of the world?
Yeah, that is, I think, a good point, that mostly Westerners. As far as the Asian Buddhists were coming from those traditional cultures, I think most of them, until recently, until the influence from the West, didn't really have access to, except maybe a few shamanic influenced traditions of Buddhism, maybe had some access to plant medicines. But it's a very small, there's not much evidence for at least any large use of psychedelics in traditional Asian Buddhism. But because of the Western influence, and Asian practitioners and teachers, I think if they're open-minded, they sometimes do try these, and I think they with mixed reviews. But yeah, I think most of the Asian practitioners and teachers don't get into Buddhism through psychedelics.
Yeah, it seems that psychedelics are maybe part of a broader opening up that people experience in the West. They're kind of searching for some kind of a spiritual grounding, right?
And very and directly experienceable. I think Allan listed some nice qualities of overlap between Buddhism and psychedelics.
Yeah, you did, Allan. Yeah, that was a really, really great list. I'm wondering if we might kind of go back and kind of look at those a little bit, so we can see, kind of what are some of the practices we're talking about. What I guess for you both is the point of doing. To the extent that they overlap. Mindfulness, compassion, those are a couple, Allan, that you mentioned.
So, well, you mean you just to talk more about that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're asking me to do.
Yeah, so what are the, what are we searching for through meditation, for example, that psychedelic experiences might inform or assist in some way, based on what you've seen, your experiences? If one purpose of meditation is greater mindfulness, then what role do psychedelics play in mindfulness? Or compassion might be another thing to look at.
Well, I think that in terms of Buddhist goals, to cultivate oneself, to become more aware, more mindful. In that sense, that's a specific goal that Buddhism itself is probably best prepared to take on. I mean, it's I'm not sure you would. I think that you can achieve some of those goals in a very conscious, very intentional practice of using psychedelics too. I wouldn't want to rule it out. but I think that psychedelics itself is not going to deliver all wrapped up and neatly put together another state of mindfulness that you just slip into. I think there's a great deal to be said for having some experience with psychedelics, of course, but I think in terms of trying to reach the goals of evolution of your character, becoming aware of the preciousness and the briefness, the brevity of life itself and your own. These are things that you can realize internally, and that's all you ever do anyway, whether you take the Buddhist route or the psychedelic route. Those realizations are within you. They're available. You can access them. And so you can have an incredible realization from taking a psychedelic, or you can just have a good time and not have any particular realizations. I think it's very interesting that I think I read that 60% of people who take psychedelics with the intention of having a spiritual experience actually do. So I don't know what happened to those other 40%. And at the same time, a great deal of people who take psychedelics with no intention at all of evolving or developing themselves. They just want to have a good time and alter their consciousness, maybe at a party or a rave or whatever, will have a deep and unexpected spiritual experience. So these things are a bit of a mystery, and of course you can't be aware of the role played by your subconscious in all of this. But I think that like I was saying before, they overlap. There is some definite relationship between the goals of a spiritual intention in taking psychedelics and training oneself in awareness through the Buddhist path, but they're very different.
Kokyo, I'm wondering if those percentages apply at all to people engaging in Buddhist practices, like meditation. Is there some percentage of people who accidentally have spiritual epiphanies, or is it the people who are intentionally participating in these practices?
It's hard to know, because we don't measure experiences so much.
Yeah.
And I think everybody comes to it for a spiritual reason. So nobody comes to meditation to party. a little different setup. But I think it's not that every time you sit down to meditate, or even for many, many years of meditation practice and other Buddhist practices, that one will necessarily have any deeply profound, life-changing experiences. Or maybe life will change, but very gradually. So it's hard to know. And then somebody maybe on their first retreat will have some really dramatic shift of perspective. But I think one way that they also overlap is related to mindfulness and compassion, is just the sense of the individual self. I think both of these are a lot about looking into what is this self, who is this, and what is its relationship to the world. The Buddha articulated this in great detail of the illusion of the independent self separate from the rest of the world, and how that's almost like automatic, like we're kind of born with this disposition to perceive separation. It has good evolutionary functions, but it also causes a lot of pain. And in fact, it's like the Buddha would say, that's the source of all discontent, is this sense of the separate individual, independent self. And psychedelics often will show that. Maybe people might not even call it a spiritual experience if they're not ready for it at a party or something. In fact, it could be the most frightening thing that's ever happened, to lose that sense of individuality. But that dissolving of the illusion of separation sometimes is spoken of as like even the goal in Buddhism. Sometimes we'd say it's either the goal, or from that dissolving of illusion of separation, then compassion can fully flow forth for all beings. And some might say that's really the goal, but in order for that compassion to come forth, we have to dissolve the boundaries between self and other.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, if also if there's a difference maybe also between the lengths of time, you know, the expectations that people have. I think often the model of psychedelic experiences is that we're supposed to have these, oh my gosh, really intense, transformative, immediate experiences. Whereas with a meditation practice, you would never expect to master it your first day.
That's right. Yeah. It's a more gradual, sometimes even unnoticeable evolving of a new kind of perception. So that would be another difference. And then because of that, then there's also more stability, or somebody could be practicing with all the, not just meditation, but all the ethical precepts and all the supporting practices of kindness and compassion and community, commitment and devotion, and all of these practices together, building up a kind of foundation, and then have a kind of we might call breakthrough or shift, and then it's very supported and stabilized. Whereas somebody might have that shift very quickly with psychedelics, but then not have a kind of stable foundation to maybe hold it or apply it. I think this is some of the gifts that Buddhism offers to the psychonauts community. Is it's like for one thing, it gives language. It gives a kind of conceptual structure, and we maybe say, well, who needs the conceptual structure? Isn't that what it's all about, dissolving that? But in fact, when we're not in that wide open space, we can then sort of assess how that was and how our path and trajectory is going based on these conceptual models that Buddhism offers a lot of, and maybe traditional psychedelics in the shamanistic traditions might offer that kind of path structure also. But I think that's one way a lot of people with these initial experiences, including myself, would then read these accounts, not just of the experiences, but of a kind of path that cultivates and stabilizes those experiences. So because of that kind of conceptual structure, and it also then there's a community of practitioners working together on this. They can compare notes and support each other, and there's the ethical principles that evolve out of the understanding that are kind of more clearly articulated than outside of a tradition. So all of these therefore the Buddhist tradition can kind of support and give a kind of framework or trellis for profound experiences, but the profound experiences maybe take a while or are less often. So I think that's another difference between the two.
Yeah, and that would explain what happened with a lot of these American or British Buddhist teachers in the 1960s and 1970s who had these LSD experiences mostly, and then found these Buddhist practices as supports, and then
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Allan, I know that you've worked with the Zendo project, the psychedelic harm reduction service, and wrote about it in a great article in Tricycle magazine. so that the harm reduction services that MAPS provides at Burning Man and other events for people who are having these expansive experiences, these mostly unplanned expansive experiences. People who go to events and they either take too much, or they get separated from their friends, or they didn't actually take what they thought they took. Something was adulterated. That happens pretty frequently. People come in having let go of these conceptual structures to the point where it's hard for them to drink water or to find where they are or to even see in front of them. So I'm wondering, what's been your experience there, and has your experience with meditation and any other practices helped you understand what's going on there, or helped you work with people and integrate their experience going forward?
Sure. Well, first of all, my experience in the Zendo project was extraordinary. It was a real gift to be able to be trusted and counted on by somebody who needed help, and help, by help I mean someone who was there to witness them, to provide them with some comfort, some basic things like a blanket and some water, and not try to intervene and not try to tell them where they're going and what's happening to them, but just be there and offer support in a nonverbal way. And it felt like such a privilege to be witnessing them in that state of vulnerability and rawness, and then see them come through the other end and start to feel much better with just having that interlude of a supportive environment and someone who's relaxed and not panicked around what they're going through, etc. So that was a powerful experience. And at the same time, it also highlighted to me how, I don't want to say dangerous, but potentially dangerous in the sense that psychedelics can be. We have, as you know, a growing festival culture. Youth are coming to festivals and taking psychedelics for the first time. Some don't really understand the principles involved in a successful experience, like set and setting, and researching, what do they have and is it really good, and sometimes they're combining it with alcohol and other materials too. So it's fraught with peril, but so I think that that's another reason that people have some initial amazing experience with psychedelics, which gives them a brief peek at what it is to have a non-dual perspective and be intimately related with the rest of the world, and a feeling of deep connection, which is just incredibly beautiful and inspiring. But then how do you follow that up in a safe way, and how do you know that you're always going to have a safe experience? And so they tend to go in the direction of Buddhism or another contemplative practice that will more safely or more in a more stable way try to give them an experience of that same nature. It's not always so easy, I think, to expect those results. In one sense, Buddhism has problems in terms of being able to give you a sense that you're making progress. It's hard to tell sometimes whether you're making progress or not on the Buddhist path. You kind of wish there was some way you could get a taste of what it is that you're working for, and you sometimes lose track of that and get discouraged. And on the other side of it, in psychedelic experience, you're definitely going to have a change of state. But it's really hard to know that it's going to be the state that you're looking for, or that it's going to bring you insight or some more expanded sense of compassion. So it's both worlds have their perils. I would say in terms of, I mentioned dangerous. I think that psychedelics can be dangerous. One of the reasons that I didn't take LSD for so long in my life is that I was concerned. I didn't know, first of all, I knew I wanted to have a family, and I didn't know how it was going to affect me genetically. I kind of didn't know, nobody knew in those days, because I'm an old guy, you know. So back then, it was like, there were a lot of people who were very happy to just gobble down the pills and not know what they were, and I was not one of them. But we've come a long way since then, and being careful about knowing your source and setting, I think you can rely on a fairly safe experience if you put the care into it to prepare it properly. But I think that there's another issue now, just as we're seeing, you know, the world changing in terms of its attitudes about psychedelics and about freedom to, I guess it's freedom of consciousness is what we're really talking about. When we see the legalization movement starting to happen all over the world, people are fed up with the idea that they can't change their consciousness, that they can't alter it in a way that they want to alter it. And so I think that's very positive. And yet there's another issue that looms in the background that I think that drives a lot of this, both in Buddhism and in psychedelics, and that is that we are slowly becoming aware that we're facing a gigantic peril, that we're actually, it's been literally described by academics that we're in another great extinction. And we are not clear about what's going to happen when all of these various assaults on nature start to play off of each other. We don't know what's going to happen to the climate. We don't know what's going to happen to the quality of our life physically on this planet. So that angst now is building up. And just like when people get very old and close to their death, they get more religious often. And sometimes they start reaching back into their family origin religion and start adopting, you know, religion that they once paid no attention to. Just in that sense, I think people will start to look around and be more searching and try to find some way of touching what's eternal and touching, trying to get some kind of relief from their existential angst, as it were. And so I think that's also driving this bringing together of Buddhism and psychedelics, oddly enough. That, I mean, Buddhism has always been respected teaching on the subject of death. For instance, in Japan, people are Shinto their whole life, and then when they get close to death, they become Buddhist. Buddhism has a lot to say about life and death and about the illusion of death, so people are attracted to it. When you add psychedelics to that, it becomes a very powerful combination, because psychedelics can give you a visceral, when I'm speaking about this, I'm thinking about my own experience with ayahuasca, which was all about death, and it was a horrifying experience and really difficult, and yet afterwards I have so much less fear about death. It's like I had already died, so I've been there and done that. And so I think the combination of Buddhism and psychedelics is a powerful one from that aspect also.
Wow, thanks, Allan. Yeah, that issue of integration is certainly very important with education. The myth that a psychedelic experience can single-handedly deliver you to some kind of higher sense of awareness without any sort of additional work is unfortunately kind of been too circulated. And really, I think it's very important for us to continue educating as many people as possible about the necessity of integration. You know, along the topic of people getting older, we definitely have a whole generation of people, baby boomers, who are getting older. And the more open, honest conversations I seem to have with people about psychedelics, it's almost as if their experiences have been repressed for years. I talked with a lot of people in their 50s and 60s who have had 1 or 2 psychedelic experiences many, many years ago, and then just never talked about it with anybody. They just said, oh yeah, that was a really fascinating experience. And then they've gone the next 30, 40 years of their life not talking about it because of the stigma against it. And so all of that time is kind of paused integration. And so I think people, for that reason, start seeking out these other practices. Really interesting.
I thought that Matthew asked an interesting question on the chat here, and about this trajectory to enlightenment or awakening. He mentions the stream enter, once returner, non-returner, arhat, and I think Allan answered that with no, it doesn't. Psychedelic doesn't offer that kind of trajectory, something like that. And I just thought it's an interesting topic.
Well, yeah.
Because we could look at it in different ways. Again, it's kind of like the map, right? Of that's like in the foundation of Buddhist path is these 4 fruitions, which are like stages to awakening. And when just thinking about the question as we're talking, the Buddha, in the Buddha's map, he defines this stream entry in detail of what exactly does this mean. It means there's these 3 kind of 3 delusions basically that drop away, that's called stream entry. And they are, again, the view of the independent self as a kind of like controller or possessor of the body and mind. If there's somebody here, that view is not just intellectually but directly seen through. There's really nobody at the helm here to directly see that as one quality. And I think that can be revealed, at least something very similar, I think, can be revealed through psychedelics. And another factor of stream entry is this belief that I thought this is kind of interesting that the Buddha talks in this way. He says it's the view that any particular kind of precepts or rules and rituals, spiritual practice guidelines and rituals will in themselves lead to complete liberation or awakening. He says you have to, that's at a stream entry, one sees through that illusion. And I think he's referring to other traditions in India where they thought if you just follow these rules and do these rituals, you will realize oneness with reality. And the Buddha's like, no. He's very pragmatic. He's like, you have to actually see through that the only thing that's going to free you is this illusion of separateness. And then the third factor of stream entry is doubt, that these teachings that the Buddha that sound very strange are, maybe he just made them up to encourage us, but it's not really possible. So at stream entry, one might not yet be a Buddha, but one has no more doubt that it's not being made up, that this is really possible. So one could have these 3, something like these 3 acts possibly in a psychedelic experience. Maybe they're not exactly the way the Buddha defined them, but in that kind of map, one could see that one could realize a new state of being, but they maybe just wouldn't have that Buddhist language for it. But then these further stages of up to the arhat in foundational Buddhism are like, then it's like they're all about applying this insight realized as a stream enter to all one's habits accumulated over a whole lifetime, or many lifetimes maybe. All these habitual responses and reactions to the world based on attachment and aversion and confusion. So that's like a long path after this entry of integration that the Buddha kind of defines also in a lot of detail. And that could also be done, but that one might be less emphasized on a psychedelic path. It might be more like, let's just keep reliving the entry again and again, and without which is helpful maybe, but how to integrate all of one's karmic, messy patterns into one's life is a lot of the work. And I would say also that psychedelics, in my own experience, they're not just about like the peak experience. They're also, especially at like lower level doses, they can be really like bring up a lot of like psychological blind spots and habits and a lot of stuff to work with in that way too. But again, without the map of how the trajectory all fits together, it might be hard to keep track of how it's going.
Yeah, I like that view of spiritual traditions providing a map or a linking together of these various experiences.
Yeah, and then we could check them even if it doesn't. Well, this doesn't seem like it's coming from Buddhist meditation, but the experiences may be quite similar, and then we can check for ourselves: are they or are they different? Like we might still have doubt about some of the things the Buddha taught, for example. So even though we don't have doubt about other things. So I appreciated the question, Matthew.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, we're right on top of question and answer time already. We're moving really quickly through this. The time is flying by. There's been a bunch of really great questions. Henrietta, how would you like to choose the questions?
Yeah, okay, so there has been like a torrent of questions, which are great, and thank you.
Yeah.
They seem like really fascinating, deep questions for everyone. So I want Jeremy and I to just dive in and put those to you. And what I suggest is, because we've got a lot, if you guys can kind of answer as succinctly as possible so that we can cover some ground. And also, I just want to quickly add to everybody, I can see you all connecting up, which is a wonderful thing. People are talking about emailing each other, meeting up.
Oh, fantastic. That's exactly what we wanted.
Exactly. So sort of
great
community building, like around the course of this webinar. And there's been a lot of discussions, Brad, about ketamine use, as you've seen. So I'm just going to start, and then Jeremy and I will sort of divide these up because we might pick out some different ones. And everybody, I'll try and we'll do our best. Okay, so let me just jump right to some of the first ones that came in. Okay, Mike, I'll just ask this quick question. He asked, does anyone think that the dark net will bring the end to the drug war? Brad, can you comment on that quickly?
Yeah, just real quickly, because it's not entirely on the topic of spirituality, but just real quick.
Yeah.
I think the darknet is definitely accelerating.
Right.
Is accelerating the spread of knowledge and the spread of substances. For example, as soon as one substance is criminalized, a new substance that's slightly molecularly altered can be circulated. So I think the darknet is just a big gaping hole in the drug war and shows how it really has no chance in controlling the distribution of these substances.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm going to ask Shauna's question. Could they talk about encountering the shadow self in a psychedelic experience within the context of Buddha's enlightenment experience with Mara? I thought that was a very interesting question.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't know if everyone knows about this Buddha's night with Mara. It's the night of his great enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and he already had a deeply cultivated meditative concentration practice and stability in meditation, and could sit still and without a lot of conceptual activity for a very long time. And once he resolved to break through everything, all the last traces of delusion, Mara is this name for it, like almost like demon-like being who attacked him with both temptations of greed and also fear and all kinds of psychological states. And so the way it's written about is like another being attacking, but in psychological terms, we could see it as it is the Buddha's own unconscious, the dark shadow side, all coming up, and the Buddha sat still in the face of all that and didn't react and didn't try to escape or fight back, and in that spirit of non-aggressiveness, Mara disappeared. I think that is as we get closer and closer to dropping away everything, Mara may get stronger and stronger, and this is true in a psychedelic experience as well as Buddhist meditation retreat or something like that. And I think that Buddhism offers a lot to in this realm to psychedelic trip, in that if all this stuff comes up, the basic instruction of not reifying and not believing in it, not like getting caught up in it, not fighting it, not trying to get rid of it, but just total openness to whatever's happening is always the practice. And so I think that goes a long way in a difficult psychedelic journey, is that complete openness and not identifying with any of the mess that's happening, while still experiencing it and learning from it, hopefully. And I think that's the difference between what could be like a really bad trip and a difficult learning experience.
Great. So I'm going to hop in here and just take the next question. This one is from Nikita. And Nikita is asking, the Buddhist tradition puts a lot of emphasis on the role of a Sangha, the Sangha. Do you think the psychedelic movement needs a more defined community?
Wow, that's a great question too. Allan or Kokyo, feel free to jump in.
Well, I would say, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I think it's true that there are some communities in the getting some feedback in the psychedelic world, especially around the shaman, like the ayahuasca community. It's all about community, actually, a big part of it. So, and I think people feel like it's not something that you maybe it's rare to just kind of do on one's own. It's generally done as kind of a group practice, and a lot of the native traditions are done in community settings. So that is different from just somebody going alone out into nature, or even just with a group of friends without that spiritual context and also ritual structure to hold the experience.
So actually, for me, MAPS is my Sangha. No, I agree that when people are together and taking these explorations together, that everyone has a more powerful experience in some sense. And yet, both in Buddhist and in psychedelics, it's very much a personal experience as well at the same time. But I'm dying to answer, or at least address, a question that I read in the chat box with Timothy asking, is it taboo to ask if the Buddha's insight under the fig tree was influenced by psychedelics?
If it's taboo, it's a good question.
None of us know. If it's taboo, I want to talk about it. But on the other hand, this question has come up in my travels around talking about Zigzag Zen, and I've thought about it a lot. We know that entheogens, or psychedelics that are known to create states of empathy and compassion and wisdom and breakthrough, whatever, were used in Shivite traditions throughout India. For instance, in the Shivite, the practice of worshiping Shiva is probably the core religion of Hindu India. And all the temples throughout India have cannabis growing in the backyard. I mean, that's a tradition that goes back to before there was written history. And the sadhus come and they rub their hands and they take the resins and they put it in their pipe and they smoke it, and that's part of their spiritual practice as well. I think datura to some extent was used, but this goes back to before the Buddha. So the Buddha for many years studied all these different traditions. He had two very prominent Hindu teachers and in Benares, which was adjacent to what was then called the Forest of Bliss, the Ananda Bhavana. And in the Forest of Bliss, where all the sadhus and holy people who were determined to grow and spiritually grow and find enlightenment would gather, the community would support them by bringing them food and laying it at the edge of the forest. And almost all of them were using ganja. Some of them were using datura. Some of them weren't using, but it was very common. And Buddha was exploring all of these modalities, including extreme ascetics, fasting for long periods. There's a lot of experience that he had with using different and trying different things. And then when he finally reached his mark, he went back and reflected on how they were all deficient. And it's hard to understand why he wouldn't, for instance, be familiar with ganja, for instance, at the very least. I mean, there was no prohibition or negative connotation to doing that. And so I've often thought about that. I think it'd be pretty hard to make a case for him having avoided that one aspect. But who's to say? We'll never know. But that's just a thought on that.
Thank
yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll wait for the next question.
To add to that, about the kind of historical ancient Buddhism and these plants, people might be interested in. There's a website, if you Google secret drugs of Buddhism. It's a Western Lama named Mike Crowley who's collected a whole book that you can read on this website of his historical research, particularly into Tantra and Vajrayana Buddhism, and its possibly psychedelic roots.
Yeah, that's a great piece.
Yeah, that's really
research.
well
That's
documented.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump in with
really
the next.
well documented, and there's actually no fewer than 12 academic scholars who have actually addressed this issue. So it's clear that there was definitely use of psychedelic plants and mixtures in the medicine bowl of the Buddha, at least in the Vajrayana tradition.
Thanks, Allan. Brad, you wanted to jump in with the next question.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
There's so much to say about all of these questions. I know we could probably have a whole session on any one of these. So my question, I'm going to read a question from Matt. He writes, I'm a Dharma practitioner interested in using psychedelics for personal and spiritual growth. I wish I had a supportive community of Dharma practitioners familiar with or open to psychedelics with whom I could discuss this topic, but I'm afraid to talk about psychedelic use in my spiritual community. Do you have any recommendations for quote unquote coming out of the psychedelic closet in our Dharma communities?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it is a taboo topic. To confess, when I posted this very event on my Facebook page, someone in my community saw it and kind of reported it to our board of trustees of the Zen Center, and they were very concerned and wanted me to take off the affiliation with the Zen Center. So I think there's and these are people who I think have done these things themselves, right? But it's a taboo topic in the Buddhist world, and I think it's very sad that people can't even talk about it, though. And I think if, especially teachers who have some experience with it, even if they're saying, well, in this community, we're not going to be doing this, at the very least, I hope that conversations could happen around it, because Buddhism is about openness and questioning everything. The Buddha himself is famous for saying, don't take my word for anything I say. You have to check it out for yourself. So it is a tough one, but you can always, I think you could ask, if you practice in a community with teachers, you could ask them about it, maybe one-on-one. You will find people who will talk about it.
Thank you, Kokyo.
Yeah, thank you so much for sticking through it and coming through. Kokyo, it's yeah, the politics and the stigma of psychedelics are still are still very strong, and I think often, even when MAPS is having conversations with senior officials at the Pentagon, often when you get people one-on-one, they're very supportive. It's as soon as you ask them on a stage or where they're expecting to be seen that people can get a little bit more risk averse or conservative.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next question is from Andrew. It sounded kind of interesting. The psychedelic experience opens perception to life and organic life. It would seem consistent with Buddhist thinking that way, correct? The subject-object distinction is dissolved in the transcendent state. Is that common to both psychedelic and Zen experience? Ethically, how can one meet up to the responsibility that realization of the experience suggests?
How can one lead up to it?
Yeah, I think, meet up. I guess they're saying, how do you respond in your life to that kind of experience, and that kind of experience where the subject and object, self and other dissolve, is that common to both psychedelic and Buddhist experiences?
Definitely. I mean, we could even say in Buddhism, it's the basis of the whole tradition. In fact, maybe put in different ways, we might say that letting go of the view or belief in the independent self. Sometimes it's said, dissolving the belief in the duality of self and other. Sometimes it's directly realizing emptiness, which is the absence of inherent existence of everything. And so they all come down to almost the same point. And so very important in Buddhism, even though it's like the basis and core of the tradition, still maybe people aren't actually having that experience so often, but it's honored as like, this is where it's going. And also, this is the basis of true compassion too. Any other kind of compassion that's based on me over here helping someone over there is in a way like of somewhat limited compassion. So one can have such an experience in either psychedelics or Buddhism, but then, as we've been talking about already, like that integration of, and what does it mean for my life? Am I willing with this new vision to actually change my life to accord with this reality? If I feel in my heart, this is really how things are, then maybe some of the things I'm doing don't make sense anymore. And am I going to say, well, let's forget about that because I don't want to change? That's the hard part, I think, in both traditions. That's the hard part. I don't know if that's exactly where the question was going.
I think that was good. Yeah.
I'm going to just jump in with a quick one from Christopher Kelly. And again, sorry everyone, there's so many questions. I think we should create a forum, Jeremy, where everyone can talk to each other on the Facebook. But Christopher says, to all of you, in the light of the scientific evidence that long-term meditators can develop an ability to self-regulate certain autonomic bodily processes, does anyone of you think that meditation can enable one to self-regulate naturally occurring DMT in the body and thereby produce a substance-free psychedelic experience?
Wow, great question.
Yeah, because yeah.
This is maybe Allan knows some about some of the scientific research here, because it could be that such things are actually going on, but the Buddhists don't traditionally don't have the concept of DMT in the brain, so they wouldn't have that map, that modern map of what's going on in the brain. Do you know anything about this, Allan?
I'm not aware of any research that addresses this particular issue. It's a fascinating question, of course, and because I think that in the tradition of Buddhism, there's definitely been evidence that meditators can control aspects of their body in surprising ways. Whether that involves releasing DMT and having basically being able to bring on a psychedelic event in their brain I'm not aware of any research on that, but it must be a very enjoyable process trying. But I don't know.
Yeah, there is a little bit of planned research that I've heard. There are some researchers, I forget who's working on it now because the research is still in development, but there is some interest in a study looking at the brain states of meditators and comparing those brain states to the brain states of people under the influence of psilocybin in particular.
Oh, no, that's well known. In fact, I was just reading about a study that was doing MRI imaging of brain states, various, both in psychedelics and meditators, and seeing a great deal of similarity between them. But in terms of being able to spontaneously create a psychedelic state by releasing DMT in the brain or whatever, that I've not heard anything about. So, have you?
Right. No, I haven't. You'd have to do a different kind of study there and actually measure the content of those brain chemicals.
I mean, there may be some correlation between, as I've heard, that DMT is produced in the pineal gland, which is like the location of the third eye, which is a chakra in Hinduism and Buddhism, and related to different mind functions. So there may be discoveries of this kind of thing just without the chemical language for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks. Jeremy, do you want to ask the next one?
Sure. Okay, so there's just so many. Oh my goodness. All right, I did see one a little bit up that looked... Okay, so this is an interesting one. Carlton asks, can you comment on secular Buddhism or Stephen Batchelor's idea of dwelling in enlightenment and how entheogens might enhance this dwelling?
Well, I'll jump in with just a comment. Stephen, in my opinion, he's one of the most authentic voices of Buddhism today, and incredibly inspiring and knowledgeable. And his new book is fascinating, called After Buddhism. Let's see. I had a thought on this. Stephen also, by the way, wrote the foreword to Zigzag Zen, and is very much a supporter of exploring in that direction as well. But I forgot the original question.
Sure. The person was asking
what was he asking?
About dwelling and how entheogens might relate to that concept of indwelling.
That in specific, I'm not familiar with. Kokyo, are you?
I don't know the term either. It sounds like maybe
dwelling in enlightenment specifically.
Again, we could say that's what it's all about. In that relaxed, open, non-reifying, non-grasping presence, which meditation is all about. And no, it's not always, doesn't always, it takes a lot of work, right, to dwell in such a space. The continuity or stability is the challenging, long, gradual path. So I think, again, with entheogens, it's like, it is interesting, I think, the difference between a super high dose where there's a lot going on and maybe a lot dissolving and a lot of input and a lot of stuff to work with, but it's so quick one can hardly do anything about it except surrender to the explosion of it, versus a kind of lower level dose where one is maybe in a more stabilized situation and can actually just rest without a lot of conceptual stuff happening. Again, maybe not so much as an ongoing path, but as a taste for resting in present, open spaciousness through entheogens.
Thank you. So sort of following up here, if that's okay, because it's sort of related, we've gotten a couple of these. This one's from Shirley, and Shirley's mentioning Jack Kornfield had earlier written in Tricycle that at some point psychedelics might be integrated into Buddhist meditation. What do you think of this? And how might it come about? And I guess the other questions have been very similar in sort of asking for a kind of a good place to start with integrating a contemplative practice with entheogenic usage. So do you have any suggestions, techniques, advice for getting started and how to begin that integration?
Seems like it's so individual. People find their own ways. It seems like there aren't communities doing this work of integration as a whole. Although I have heard of one group that involves Buddhist Vipassana meditation and ayahuasca, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's on the web somewhere. And I think they're trying to actually do this as a community in Brazil. I think they do their retreats. But apart from that, I think it's kind of the frontier, the fringes, where people are doing this individually and talking with each other about it. And it's hard to imagine it becoming a widespread integration in a kind of accepted by the larger community, especially with legality issues. But I wouldn't rule it out, because Buddhism has always mixed with the cultures that it enters. When Indian Buddhism came to China, it mixed with this native Taoism that's quite different in many ways, and they really integrated completely. And in Tibet, the Buddhism mixed with this Bon shamanism, and they integrated quite harmoniously also. So it could be that one of our modern Western spiritualities is this entheogenic religion, we might even say. And so it could be that there will be an integration there over a long time. We'll see. Or and also, by the way,
I'd like to add to that.
May I just say, I have a Dharma talk that I have to attend in just like 2 minutes, so I have to step out of the conversation. And I really enjoyed it, and let's all stay in touch. I'm on Facebook if people want to continue conversation.
Thank you, Kokyo.
Yeah, thanks, Brad, for getting us all together, and
thank you,
me and Henrietta.
Thank you, Kokyo. Great.
Thanks. Be well,
Thanks,
everyone.
Kokyo.
Many blessings for everyone's practice.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kokyo.
You're
Yours as well.
welcome. Take care.
So I'd like to jump in there also on that question, because of course Zigzag Zen, the book, was all about that. And I do expect that from my experience that the two practices, the two worlds, will come more and more together over time, and that this is going to create opportunities for us to understand Buddhism as well as psychedelics both more clearly when we look at them in conjunction with each other. And I'm also hopeful that psychedelics and Buddhism, together or separately, will assist us in deep ecological intelligence and promote our sense of kinship with all living beings. Because I think if we have any hope to survive the changes that are underway, it's going to be through awakening of this kind. And so I guess my hope is that the Bodhisattva path becomes the new archetype for planetary activism. And I think there is, my experience at Burning Man, for instance, and also in groups where we've had conversations about this, is that people are seeing that they do play with each other quite well, so that you can have a practice, a Buddhist practice, and at the same time have experiences with psychedelics, and then bring those insights or experiences back to your sitting practice and meditate on them and integrate them, so that there is an interesting way of working with both in both worlds. So I'm hopeful that the point of all that is not only for our personal liberation, but for our liberation as a species.
Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Brad, are there any other questions that you see that you really feel are pertinent, or Alan, because I know you're looking at them too. Just we've just got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, lots of them.
I mean, can you pick one out? Because I want you to be able to do that, because there are so many.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do one more. One kind of recurring question that came up, and of course, wish Kokyo was still here, but we can definitely address this. Kokyo is just great. I am just so glad he was able to join us and take time and just like deal with the politics and all of that. It's just such a privilege to have that perspective. What about this question of validity, Alan? I'm thinking so. Often, I think psychedelic experiences are seen as, well, that was just a drug experience. If we're seeking some kind of spiritual experience that we can either integrate or continue or grow through our meditative or spiritual practice, is that first experience a true experience, and is a drug experience more or less true than a spiritual experience? And if not, then what's the difference, or what isn't the difference?
All right, so I'm having some connection issues, but so what I heard from that is that the questioner is, as the person is asking, can you criticize a psychedelic experience or the insights or the experience that you have as somehow being inauthentic because they're produced by a substance versus the same insights that you might have in a Zendo that would be coming from you and not from the material? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. The question
is that what was being asked?
Yeah. I'm
not sure I heard it
real quick. The question is from Terry, who asks, how about the question of the validity of mystic experience, enlightenment achieved by years of practice versus dropping acid one night? Are both experiences the same thing?
Okay. Well, no, they're not the same, of course. And yet you can have an insight that has been stimulated by a material or a substance and have an insight that blows your mind and your whole life upside down, just completely changes your life. You can spend 25 years going to meditation group and sitting and studying all the teachings of the Buddha and not have that kind of a momentous insight. So that's also true. Now, the question of where did it come from, the substance, or did it come from your brain? I mean, the brain is not an isolated a mechanism. I mean, you eat food and that has an effect on your brain. Your sleeping habits has an effect on your brain. Your relationships have an effect on your brain. So there's no isolated, separate integrity to an experience that you have outside of psychedelics versus one that you have with psychedelics. So I don't buy that at all. I think it's more likely that your insights that would result from 30 years of Buddhist meditation is going to be more reliable, more stable, and perhaps more useful and easier to integrate than an amazing flash of insight that you get with a substance, and then you don't maybe have difficulty even remembering it, let alone integrating it later. But that's not always the case. So I think the drawing hard lines between one and the other don't really work either.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, this has been an amazing
I hope that
conversation.
answers it to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a difficult question, and I think just asking the question and talking about it is, I think, itself productive. And so maybe that tension, that unanswerability of some of these questions is exactly their value. So yeah, I just wanted to say, since we're running over time, that it's been an amazing conversation. It makes me even more excited for the rest of this course. Allan, I'm so grateful. Thank you for spending time with us. Also, thank you to Kokyo, who's so busy with his practice that he had to go off and continue it. We'll be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. November 11th for our special Veterans Day session.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks everybody out there.
Thank you.
To say that, yeah, thank you to all of you. We've had so many questions and such a lot of dialogue going on that Jeremy and I are going to help facilitate a forum where everyone can keep talking. And somebody out there in the audience, Nikita, suggested Slack, which is a very good way of talking. You know, for those who don't use Facebook as well, it's just
great.
Yeah, so, and we'll also figure out a way to sort of join all these questions together so that everybody has access to them and we can start, you know, keep the dialogue going, because there were some really fantastic ones and a lot of very various ones, as you saw. So thank you all for starting this off with such a bang.
Yeah, and thank you both for maintaining the technical end. It worked really great. This software seems to work very effectively.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. There'll be a couple of tweaks that hopefully we can do for next week, and that people ask about in the chat box. So we'll work on that. But yeah, we'll look forward to next Wednesday with who's the guest?
It'll be Ryan Lecomte and Nicholas Blackston, 2 U.S. Marine veterans involved in psychedelic therapy research, talking about the role of spirituality and spiritual experiences in healing from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, that's going to be extremely fascinating and helpful.
And Allan, please tune in as a guest and feel free to ask hard questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you, Brad.
That sounds like a great thing. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And the participants were amazing with incredible questions, and really appreciated their questions very much.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay, so we'll convene next week and hope you'll join us too, Allan. Okay.
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 Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.